Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomoreshee.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode of our series on prophecy, part 5, Dealing in Extremity. Welcome back to the No More Shade broadcast, where we continue our series on prophecy with part 5, and we discuss again more of the debates in scholarship and how people deal with dating issues, the extremities, and we focus on what is important, these issues or the actual messaging intended when they were produced. When we say prophecy is predictive and we move that all of Daniel is in this century and all of Isaiah is in this century and all of Job is in this century, and they are historical, and Jonah did actually spend 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of a whale, then Jesus actually spent 3 days and 3 nights, and we have to move the crucifixion dates so that Jesus is crucified not on Friday, but on Thursday, no on Wednesday, no on Tuesday. I mean, he has to spend an actual full day, because we then say Genesis means an actual 24-hour day. So there are 6 actual 24-hour days in the days of creation, and we have to have that. Then we have to have Jesus spending actual 72 hours in the grave. So we have to move the crucifixion. We allow no liberty at all with the text. And, we don't apply any other understanding. We get very literal and we get very concrete with the text. And so we have to have a Wednesday crucifixion. And really, when most of tradition has for centuries understood it to be Friday. And that raises another debate where we have so much coming out of the Protestant Reformation that tradition became so questioned, and private interpretation of the text became supreme, to the point that we began to ignore traditions, in some cases maybe rightly so, if the logic is there to do so. And one would grant that if that is what the entire church sees and not what one person sees, and tries to make paramount to the exclusion of all others in the faith. But we threw the baby out with the bathwater when we decided to discard all of tradition, and we no longer consider anything that follows the first century period as legitimate understanding of the text. And that is interesting because it narrows our vision in one sense, but then it opens us up to blind spots, as if those people who immediately followed got everything wrong. That seems to be more of a fallacy at the outset, to discredit everything that they say and ignore it. And so obviously these things have been passed down to us from generation to generation, and the text itself is merely the same. It was oral tradition that was written down. Somebody spoke these words, somebody told these stories, and eventually it was written down, and we have them in the final form. And so we have to be careful of this supremacy of text over tradition, if that means that we read the text from our perspective and ignore its original animus. And so we go overboard in our interpretation. And I'm not here to debate all of these issues. I'm just saying they're out there. But there are very few actual scholars who are going to go with a Wednesday crucifixion. There are some scholars that do, but they're not biblical scholars. They're PhDs in metallurgy or whatever. They're not. So we have to be careful. So when you study these things out, you're going to find out that there are certain things that the text intends that we need to allow room for, and that when we read the text centuries later, 2,000 years later, and we apply our sensibilities, modern sensibilities on it, we can be overcritical or over conservative fundamental and force the text to be something it's not. We have to be careful. So those debates are out there. I'm just introducing them so that my students can understand that, hey, they're out there. And there are people that believe that Job is late, and there are people that believe Job is early, and there are people that believe that Job did not exist, and they're fine with that, and that does not in any sense invalidate the text as God's holy word, if God chooses to use that as a literary device.
Often what drives me here in this debate is, would this have affected those to whom it was written, and with those to whom had it subsequently? Not us thousands of years later, but those at the time that this is being gathered together and curated. Would they have asked these questions of this text? Would that have any bearing on them and the message that God wanted them to receive as He used these human vessels to convey His message to other humans? I'm wondering how much of our modern debate issues that we seem to think are so hot button were not even close to anything for those people in that day. They had very little, if any, bearing on factors of what was being messaged.
Did every time Jesus tell a story, there was a man that went from
On the road to Jericho,
is he actually, then do we have to force Jesus to be talking about an actual event that actually happened? Really? Was there an actual man named Lazarus who died and was in the actual bosom of Abraham and who spoke to an actual rich man who actually had 4 brothers? Do we have to force the text that actually has to take place because he used the name Lazarus? So therefore it has to be an actual story that actually happened? Or can he just be telling a story to illustrate a point? And we then get into all kinds of debates. And the problem is we want to play it safe. We have to have an all or nothing. It has to be all this way, or we're afraid it slides too far to the other side. And then all of a sudden, Jesus did not rise from the dead because we get scared. If we let go of a little bit, then that means we have to let go of it all. And that means that anyone who lets go a little bit, then they let go of all. And that's the real question. Can we allow for certain things and still hold to the core doctrines of our faith and allow the text is actually doing? Because then some people are going to say, well, if there is no historical person named Jonah or Job, then there was no historical person named Jesus. Is that what we're saying? No, we're not.
we're not saying that because this is not some childish game like 2 children on the playground arguing over their mothers, and my mother or your mother, and taking mother and then getting in a big fight. No, we're not doing childish games, but that's what it seems like when thousands of years later we reduce the text to these kind of arguments. And both sides are guilty of going to either extreme, saying it's all or nothing. And I think that in the middle, the text is doing something far more marvelous for us to pay attention. And we should accept it just as the ancients accepted it for what it is, and not get hung up on what we wish it would be, whether we're trying to discredit it or whether we're trying to put the screws down to make sure nothing's loose, because we're afraid that if one thing comes loose, then all of a sudden that means the whole thing unravels and we lose our faith because it's so fragile. No, I don't think the text is that fragile by any means. And I must confess that at one point in my career academically, I was at that point of being childish and caught up in such games. And I'm trying to help you understand that you don't need to play such games, that there are solutions to these problems that have been dealt with and they're worthy of research. But don't let these things distract you from, again, the main messaging that God has from the text.
So we have to be careful. And again, there are scholastic academic debates on all of this stuff, going back and forth. And so you can gauge all of those and decide on all and work through those. But know that the debates are out there, waiting to engage in them as you are led to, based upon what your needs are and what you need to do with the time that God has given you. But does that mean that we have to limit ourselves? I don't think so, because I want to spend more of my time on what God wanted from the book that we have in 4 chapters of Jonah. What God intended in his messaging, I think, is far more important on whether we debate whether Jonah actually was a person who actually lived in a certain time, and actually we spend all of our time defending that, and Jonah did spend 3 days and 3 nights in the whale, and it has to be 72 hours. It can't be 73. It cannot be 71. If we do that, then we're going to miss out on what God intended. Does the 6 time periods in Genesis 1, do they actually have to be 24-hour days? Can they? Can they not be? Well, what is the messaging? What is the whole point of what we now call Genesis 1, which, again, the verse numbers are off, and scholars are divided where to divide. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, or half of verse 4. I mean, that's how the debates are. Some people, want half of verse 4 of chapter 2 to go along with Genesis 1. That's just where the debates are. That's just how some people see it. And others are fine with it ending at verse 3, So that's just where they are. And you have to be willing to enter into those debates and understand they're there. And that's okay. And then where you end up on that.
And part of this is the reason why that I did struggle with this earlier. And I made an exit very early on from scholarship and academia because of these type of arguments, thinking that if this is what academia is about, I don't want to be about that. And I didn't realize, again, I threw out the baby with the bathwater. And so it was my extremes of either or, instead of understanding that I can let those in scholarship who deal with these issues deal with them and offer arguments on both sides and work it all out, and know that there are good arguments on both sides, and let the chips fall wherever they fall when the data points are considered, while I can focus using the same academic tools elsewhere and get at the messaging, which I think is far more exciting for me. But then again, there are those who wish to defend the faith, and there are those who wish to try to make something of the faith that it's not and discredit it. And, all those debates are fine, and they're there, and they're worthy of pursuit by those who are called to pursue them and go in that direction.
And will you stay? Will you stay at the same place you are today in your thinking? Or will you change your mind tomorrow? And it doesn't have to be an all or nothing approach. And that's the question. And so when we're talking about prophecy as only predictive, then yes. And we need that. And we set up the Bible to be something that needs that, requires that. We make God, and he has to. Therefore, Daniel cannot be a work from the 2nd century. And Daniel has to be a historical figure that existed. And all of it has to come from this century and not that one. When we start doing that, then we limit ourselves, and we might miss out on some of the other perspectives. And I'm not saying the other perspectives have it all right, because the debates are such that there are problems on both sides. And, you have to go through the debates. But I'm more concerned about what was the intended messaging. Because Jesus, I don't think when he's talking about Daniel, or when someone, one of the gospel writers, has Jesus make an allusion or an echo to Daniel, what is Jesus intending when he alludes to or echoes Daniel or cites Daniel? Is it an actual Is he actually citing Daniel? Then what is Jesus doing? Does he want to date Daniel at that time? Does he want to have a debate on whether there was a historical person named Daniel? Or does he want to say, I'm fulfilling that? Because, we sing that song, Behold, he comes riding on the clouds. Well, Luke has Jesus referring to, I'm that guy, from what we call Daniel 7.
And what is this referent all about in the Second Temple period literature? What are they tracking upon from previous traditions that date back centuries, thousands of years ago, where the gods rode the clouds? What is he grabbing? Merely historically Daniel, or the traditions that he is tying into that are being spoken of in this time period?
Well, does that mean that Jesus is arguing whether there's historical Daniel or not? Does that mean that Jesus is wanting to argue with that Daniel was written this century or that century? Or does, what's going on there? And so these are important debates. And so how does that work? And it's interesting. I think it's extremely interesting that if there are people who date Daniel's writing to the 2nd century, and if you can do that, and there are problems with that view, but there are problems with the other view. If you do that, and some of the material then in Daniel can at least be understood to be at least curated or brought together or a part of the dialogue that's in that 2nd century BC, 2nd century before the Common Era, then what does that mean? And I think when we do that and we allow for that dialogue, then there's some things that come interestingly to the forefront in our view of prophecy. And some people just cannot, because they cannot lose this argument. This is a sword to die upon. I have to die on this hill, and I'm willing to fall upon my sword if I have to. I have to die. I will jump up there and I will die on this hill, because it has to be prophecy is predictive only. Then I think you miss on some of the things that may be happening with prophecy, if that is what you end up deciding that you have to do. At the same time, if none of it's predictive, if all of it's written, late, none of it's written early, then I think you also miss things, because there are problems with that as well. And so it's up to you. So if you want to get into the dating of Daniel, I've introduced James Bijan from Trinity House, and his stuff is available on academia.edu, and he gets into some of the stuff you can go to. And whether or not you agree or disagree with him, I only point out that he's available. And so he addresses some of the issues, and you can at least go to his material, and it's free on academia.edu. So go to our episode on that, and then find James Bijan, and his material is free, and click on it and get the PDF and read and study it. And whether or not you agree or disagree with him, at least you'll get into the debate. And he will present the problems on both sides and the solutions offered by both sides. And at least you can get into it and begin to understand it for what it is. And then maybe you can, eventually, if your institution allows you access to the stuff that's not free, you can begin to get involved in debate if that's important for you. Again, that plays into part of your interpretation of who those 4 kingdoms are that Daniel's referring to. And so that all gets into the debate, and how Jesus then grabs onto those and what he's doing. And so that gets into debate, and that gets into the patterns. And what we talked about before, when Matthew grabs Hosea, and Hosea is grabbing Moses, and Moses is grabbing Genesis 1, and how much of those threads and strands are being grabbed onto, and what's happening, and what's going on. So all of that plays in part in all of that is what's happening. And so you got to deal with all of that, and you got to decide what Jesus is doing with Daniel. And you got to decide what Daniel is doing, and what he's grabbing onto, and what he's doing as prophecy when he's predicting or he's grabbing events. All of that comes into hand. And so it snowballs. There you have it. Scholarship is divided. And if it was simple, then there would be one solution. But you have all of these scholars reading the text and coming up with different viewpoints, and they're falling into different camps. And so maybe one camp has ideas that are worth at least listening to, but maybe you don't agree with. But at least by listening to the arguments, it might give you a way to understand or at least look at the text in ways that you had not previously thought. So, are these hills to die on? That's the question. And for some people, they are. And because of that, they will then do the cancel culture. And they say, I cannot listen to that. And then that's when we start getting into our echo chambers. And because we can't listen to that, and we can't listen to this person, they have nothing good to say. So we disagree with Bijan, or we agree with him, but then because we agree with him, we disagree with someone else. We cannot listen to those arguments. And then that means certain aspects can never be spoken to us. And so then, we start saying, well, I can't handle what John Collins has to say about this. Because, and is it, which Collins are we referring to? Because there's several different John Collinses. And they have their own divergent views about these things. And so we can't listen to them. And yet they hold quite a bit of sway. And it's interesting what they have to say and whether we agree or disagree. And hopefully we're never going to agree 100% with anyone. And I don't agree with 100% of myself because I change my views as I mature in understanding and study more, and I get a better grasp, and new data points or new ways of looking at old data points come to my knowledge that are worth considering. So there you have it.
Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.